You are tuned in to the Creative Frequency. Come with us as we explore the creative process with artists from all areas of the creative spectrum. The Creative Frequency starts now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Creative Frequency. It's your host, Kent Tarbox, coming at you from Studio 20 in the Jones Building in downtown Findlay, Ohio. If you've been here before, you know what it is that we do. If not, this is what we do. We bring in creatives, artists, poets, musicians, anybody from all over the creative spectrum, and we talk to them about their craft, about their art, and the things that they face while doing their art. So, as you can tell, this is a little different today. I've got an in-studio guest, which is a little rare. So I'm going to ask my guest. We're going to dive right into it.
Sure.
Introduce themselves.
Well, first of all, thanks, Kent, for having me on the podcast. My name is Dan Chudnizski. I am a sculptor and artist, and when I'm not doing that, I serve as the director at the University of Findlay's Mazza Museum, which has the world's first and largest collection of original art from picture books.
Okay. I want you to take a moment here. So why don't you plug Mazza for a minute? Tell us about the children's art and just tell us about Mazza for a minute.
Sure. So the Mazza Museum started in 1982. There was a professor at the time, it was Findlay College. His name was Jerry Mallett, and he would teach future teachers, and he used picture books to do that. In 1982, university was about to celebrate its 100th anniversary. And at the time, they were still Findlay College. They were actually becoming the University of Findlay. And so they were trying to launch new initiatives that would last the next 100 years, ideally. And they asked for ideas. He had an idea that it would be great to have a place where you could go to see the original works of art that were used to create these beloved picture books. And at the time, there was nothing like that in the world. And so he reached out to August and Alita Mazza, who were alumna from the class of 1941, and they put up the seed money to purchase the first 4 works of art. And it really started as a collection. It wasn't a museum at the time,
Right.
because there was not enough artwork to need a building. So it really started in the basement of Schaefer Public Library. The goal was to get 1 original every year, and they figured in about 30 years they'd have a pretty good collection. By the time I started, which was in 2015, they were at about 9,000. Today we're over 22,500 at this moment, and that's with a lot of art waiting to be processed and more coming in every day.
That's absolutely amazing. And for those of you, if you're in Findlay, Ohio, I highly recommend you make a stop, you go in there. It's a really cool place. And the art and the illustration that is in children's books it's everywhere. It's across the entire spectrum. And I've had the opportunity, and I remember when it was in the basement of Schaefer, because I went to University of Findlay when it was Findlay College. And I remember, and it's like, oh, okay. And I believe, it used to be Dr. Mazza down here there was a doctor, Mazza. I don't know.
We say Mazza.
You say Mazza, I say Mazza. Right. Yeah. So, Mazza. Yeah. But I encourage you, if you get a chance, people, and check it out. I know they're on the web. And I believe even did WBGU do a documentary?
Yes,
on
PBS,
PBS
filmed one. We actually filmed that during the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's called The Magic of Mazza.
Yeah.
So that's free and available to watch online.
Right. So folks, again, if you get a chance, check it out. This is going to be in the show notes. So I wanted to give Dan a chance, because Mazza, it's a remarkable place. It's a one-of-a-kind place. And to think that it's in Findlay, Ohio. Because ask anybody that lives in Findlay, there's nothing to do here. But this is probably one of the greatest collections of children's books and illustrations. I was in there, what was it, a year ago? You did the Harry Potter thing.
That was, oh gosh,
or was it 2 years ago?
That was more than 2 years ago now. Yeah, okay. So 2.5 years.
So you get old, you lose track of time, people. So on top of, in your creative endeavors as the curator and director of this, you create and curate for the public. And you obviously have themes with the illustrators and the artists and that, but you also have a personal side of your creative self. And let's talk about what you do when you're not in Mazza.
Sure. So I should lead by saying that I never anticipated that I would one day become a director of an art museum. That was not something that I set out to do.
Okay.
I knew from a very early age I wanted to be an artist, and I wouldn't say it was a want, it was a compulsion. I needed to create art, and I tell people that that really was my first language. Art's a form of communication, and I could communicate more effectively as a toddler through pictures when I did not yet have the vocabulary to articulate myself. Um, and then now I have the advantage of being able to fully articulate myself artistically, which is wonderful, but then also to be an advocate for artists through the museum role. So it
Right.
has, I would say, it's a lifestyle. It's not a job. There is no off switch. I would never wanna find the off switch.
Okay.
And when I wake up, the first thing I'm thinking about before I think about what I'm gonna wear or what I'm gonna eat for breakfast is, what am I gonna do in the studio? What am I gonna do at the museum? I do that all day, and then I dream about that at night, and I repeat. And so there's never a shortage of inspiration, it's just a shortage of time, of hours in the day
Right.
to get something done. And I think the difference now, when I'm making art, when I go to the studio, I may have less time to do that during the day because of the day job. But the time that I am using in the studio is more informed because all day I'm getting fired up by looking at the best examples of their
Right.
kind in the genre. And you see thousands of examples of people who've done it. They've succeeded. So it's not this mystery, this lofty goal that can't be done. The more you meet these artists, you learn their stories.
Right.
And I should backtrack a bit because I'm originally from Fremont, Ohio. And Fremont, I'll be the first person to tell you, there's amazing things that happened there
Right.
that made it what it was. Rutherford B. Hayes lived there. I grew up on part of that estate. So you had the leader of the free world at one time chose
Right.
to live and die in Fremont, which is worth noting. But he wasn't the first important person. He won't be the last. But what I'm getting at is, you look at, when I was a kid, I wanted to see great art. And there weren't a lot of places in Fremont that you could go to see that. And so I had to travel far away to
Mhm.
learn to be an artist. And one of those places was in Italy. I spent a lot of time training in Italy to be a marble carver, among other things. And I remember there was a day that I was getting particularly excited because there were 4 original Da Vinci's in the room that I was standing in. And the Italian artists were all kind of laughing at me, thinking that I was being dramatic because I was having a pretty strong response to these.
Right.
And I said, "You don't get it. We don't get to see things like this where I'm from." And they said, "Well, like, how far would you have to go to see a Da Vinci?" And I said, "There is one in the entire Western Hemisphere right now." And I said, "It's in Washington, D.C., and it's not his best work. You have 4." And I said, "Just in this room.
Right.
And on your way to work, you pass additional ones." You see it so much that it doesn't hit you as hard, but, it dawned on me back then that, what would it take to bring some of that great art here? Florence wasn't always Florence.
No.
There were things that had to happen to bring the artists there. Findlay, in Northwest Ohio, and Ohio by extension, is more of an artistic hub than people realize.
Right.
There are world-class creatives here.
Yes.
Some of the best, most influential artists in all of history came out of this pocket of the country. And I don't think that's gonna slow down anytime soon.
No, and I agree with that, and I like the part about when you talk about being in Italy, because being in Europe as an American, and when I was in the military, we traveled all over. Um, and in England, I walk around, I feel like I'm living in a museum.
Mhm.
Everything's a museum. Everything's a work of art. You walk into a church in rural England that's 600 years old, and it's still serviceable. And
Right.
there's paintings, and and then when you go to Italy, and like you said, you realize, and I don't know if people think about this, in Italy, Rome, for example, somebody wakes up in the morning, and they go about their morning evolution, and they grab a cup of coffee, and they grab their briefcase or whatever, and they head to work, and they walk by some of the greatest works of art we've ever seen, and it's just scenery.
Right.
And you're right, and for others, it's a trip of a lifetime.
Mhm.
It's, to get to Rome, to get to the Vatican, to get to Paris, to get to London, whatever. So I appreciate that, and as a kid, I grew up in Fostoria.
Mhm.
Okay, and fortunately, I had a family. I had a grandfather and a grandmother that loved to travel. So before I even went in the military, I was in all 48 states,
Wow.
and I got Alaska and Hawaii in the military.
Wow.
So even there, you get to see there's art
Right.
everywhere.
Right.
And you're right. In Ohio is really more influential than people think. And I'm going to throw this note out there for people. If you don't know this too, I just found this out maybe a year ago, and this floored me about Ohio.
Mhm.
Ohio is the birthplace of funk.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Okay.
Dayton, Ohio, ladies and gentlemen, is the
No
birthplace
kidding.
of funk. There's a documentary on PBS or HBO, one of these, about funk, and they got and George Clinton obviously
Mhm, mhm,
is emceeing this thing, and it takes you through the evolution of funk. And they said that Ohio was a magnet for funk because there was the auto workers,
mhm.
there were a lot of musicians, and it was easy to put all these guys in a van and take them to Toledo, take them to
Sure.
Cleveland, take them to Cincinnati, drive them to Chicago,
Yep.
drive them to the. Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, if you've driven through Ohio, funk is not the first thing that
No.
enters your mind.
Eh,
Um,
we did a show, it started years ago at the Mazza Museum, and we did the opening of the show actually at the Rife Gallery down in Columbus,
mhm,
which is across
mhm,
from the State House.
mhm.
And I was working with that director at the time, and they said, "Could you curate a show that would not only draw school kids, but would draw people that are coming to the State House for work, and they'd come over on their lunch break, and make it something related to Ohio?" And so the idea for a show called Ohio: The Start of It All was born. And I started researching facts like that because I wanted talking points that people could be proud of when they came from Ohio. And it was part of me being a teacher and hearing my students say, like, nothing exciting ever happens
Right,
here.
right,
And I knew that that wasn't the case. So we put together 60 of those talking points, and then we paired them with an original illustration from a book that showcased something from that. So it might show the Wright brothers, and it would
right,
say, this was aviation was born in Ohio. And then there were some that were more unusual and more surprising. We showed, like, I tried to tie one of the facts as close as possible to every venue that the show traveled to.
okay,
So one of them in Columbus was 3 blocks away, was the first full self-serve gas station anywhere. And you don't think about that, you
right,
take it for granted, but things, Ohio can lay some amazing claims to,
right,
things like, chewing gum, like, comes from Ohio, the pop top of a can, which, it might not be super exciting to most people, but we use it every day. It
right,
changed the way
right,
people live. And what that did was it gave people, one, a reason to be interested in Ohio, and then by extension, they were discovering the art from these books and these books. And that's the other part that I would say I would encourage any artist or creative or curator to have. What I learned when I became a curator was what the word meant. It's a Latin word that means to care for. And so it's your job to look after something. But then I took it in a different direction as well. Not only did I wanna take care of something, I felt it was my responsibility to give people a reason to care about
right,
that thing, because if they do, it'll outlast all of us, and that's the reason why there are churches in England that are 600 years
right,
old that people still go to. So that's the other part, is this great art that we have and we show, or maybe even the art that you're making in your studio, somebody has to care about it for that thing to survive long term,
right,
and you are the best advocate for your creations. Or if I'm, working for other artists,
right
I'm the advocate for them when
for
they
them.
can't be in the room.
So let's this is interesting, and full disclosure, neither Dan nor I are paid by the Ohio Tourism Board or anything,
No, not
okay?
at all.
No, but if you're seeing this Ohio Tourism Board, you know where to send a check. Would appreciate it. Now, so let's talk about what goes into the creative side of curating
Mhm,
a show, because I'm assuming there's a brief
mhm.
or there's an idea, there's a theme,
Sure,
and you touched on it a little bit, but take us through a process
sure.
or what people don't know.
I'll talk you I'll take you through the process I'm going through right now.
Okay.
I was doing it this morning before I came, and I'll go do it again this afternoon. So I have a show that I curate every summer, and I started this before I became involved with Mazza as an employee. I had a call, from the museum, and at the time I was running a college art program in Fremont, and they had an artist cancel and they had an empty gallery space. So they said, "Could you fill this gallery next month?" And I said, I think I can make that work. What's the theme have to be? And they said, it's wide open. So this was the university space. It's called the Lay Gallery. It's in the building with Mazza, but it's something that is an independent gallery. So we can bring in artists that aren't related to picture books, or it
Okay.
could be a faculty or student show. At the time, I was in Kansas City as part of this show called Spectrum Fantastic Arts Live, which was the best in contemporary fantasy art. And I had been nominated for an award, so I had never before had an excuse to be in the room with all of these artists. And we were out at dinner that night, and I met a guy who, he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Ohio." And he's like, "Where in Ohio?" And I said, "It's a small town." And he said, "Try me." I said, "Fremont." And he says, "My 2 best friends are from Fremont." Are you kidding me? And he pulls out his phone.
Right.
There they are, and they live down this like a mile from the house I grew up in. So that gave me an idea, and he said, "You're another Ohio guy." He was from Yellow Springs, and he's pointing around all these famous artists at the table, and he's like, "Ohio, Ohio, Ohio." And I said, "Hey, I've got an idea for a show." And I just pitched it to him at the restaurant. I said, "If you could create your favorite character from any fairy tale and not have an art director tell you what that looked like, who would you make?" And I knew we were onto something when 2 hours later, the staff was telling us we had to clear the restaurant because we're all still talking about it.
Right. Right.
And we went back to the hotel and talked about it. And so I made a deal with them. I said, "If you guys can create a work for next month," and these are people that are working on, at the time, like Game of Thrones, shows like that. They're
Right.
very busy. I said, "If you create an original, you send it to Findlay, Ohio, and you wanna offer it for sale, I'll get you 100% of the commission as a thank you for participating, just for sending your art to Findlay."
Right.
And so we had this show. The show was born called the Enchanted Brush Exhibition. We're now getting ready for our 12th season of it. It will open in on June 15th at the museum and it'll run through August 14th.
Okay.
And what I do every year is I send a prompt out to these artists who are now, some of them, very well known, and I'm always looking for new. And I say, it has to be tied to literature and fairy tales, not just fairy tales, but you need to create an original work of art, and we'll put it on display, and it'll debut in Findlay, Ohio. And it'll be offered for sale in Findlay, Ohio for the lowest price anybody in the world will ever get access to
Right.
it. So the idea there was to create incentive for these artists who might not normally make a work of art to come to Findlay to send something. So we started getting art. And this year's theme is called Homage. So I sent them a list about a year ago. And I said, these are some of the master illustrators in the Mazza collection. And I have more if there's one that's not on the list. I'd like you to pick somebody that inspired you. And I want you to create an original work of art based off of their work. And so, for example, the poster this year is done by a Chicago artist, Aaron Miller, who does a lot of stuff for like Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons. And he was inspired by Maurice Sendak, who created Where the Wild Things Are. So you'll come into the exhibit, you will see his contemporary painting on display next to an original by Maurice Sendak
Wow.
of Where the Wild Things Are. And we have things from Eric Carle, who did Very Hungry
The Hungry
Caterpillar,
Caterpillar. Yeah.
next to two contemporary artists that have created a work, Alan Douglas and Reiko Murakami, that created their take on a contemporary Carl style illustration. So it's the first time we've done that. But the point of that is to show that there are things happening right here in Findlay,
Hmm.
Ohio, that are continuing this tradition of art history that goes back to the dawn of humanity before civilization started. And this show is free. It's
Right.
absolutely free and open to the public. So I encourage people to bring 100 of their closest friends
Right.
when they're in the neighborhood.
There you go, folks. And all this information is going to be in the show notes, and there's websites available and everything. And at the end of this, I'll make sure it's all included in the final cut. Um, so you have this very creative environment you work in. You're around creatives. Your mind is always ginning and always going. What happens when you hit a roadblock? And do you hit roadblocks?
Oh,
And how
yeah.
do you overcome them?
I hit them every day. And the difference is when you hit them and you survive them, they're not as daunting in the future. And I have a good team. I'm gonna preface everything with that. I have very good people with me, and it's a small staff,
Hmm.
but we punch above our weight class. And, you look at most museums our size, and they will have a full-time staff of 80. We have 4, and we have great volunteers. So what that shows me is you have a community that's invested in the success
Right.
of this mission, and this mission's bigger than any one of us. It's not our collection. We're just fortunate enough to be the stewards of this work, and these artists trust us with their legacy. And so roadblocks, yeah, you hit roadblocks all the time, and a lot of that is, I would say, with buy-in, is is somebody interested in an idea? Is it viable? And there's a lot of times where you have to be willing to invest in yourself to show somebody that it is functional. And that, I think, for most creatives is the challenge, because there are people who just cannot visualize something that does not yet exist in the world.
Right.
And there are tools now to make it easier for the layperson to do that. However, there is a magic when somebody can sit down with just a pencil
Right.
and put that thing into existence or give a glimpse of what it could be. And so it all comes back to that mantra of give them a reason to care. When I
Hmm.
hit a roadblock, there are times where you just have to pivot. Maybe something isn't the best idea at the time, but when you realize that failure is an essential part of the process, it doesn't shut you down when you hit those blocks. So yes, do I hit roadblocks every single day? I hit roadblocks, but I'm not deterred by them.
Okay. And I think that that's a great point, because people that aren't in the creative sphere, and a lot of this has to do with the stereotype of creatives, you don't wake up in the morning and get your coffee and lounge about and feel like, well, I'm going to go to the studio for an hour, and then I'm going to create for an hour,
Mhm.
and then I'm going to go hang out with my friends. And this is work,
Mhm.
and it's a commitment. And it becomes, and I like to use the word, and I use it in a positive manner, it becomes an obsession.
Mhm.
And as long as it's navigated in a positive way, it can produce remarkable things. There is a destructive element sometimes to creatives
Mhm.
and creativity. Fortunately, I haven't had many on here that have went through anything like that, which is good. But I see the result of the labor, and I think people need to appreciate this is work.
Mhm.
This is a life, not just a thing. And it's a responsibility of all of us, like you say, this
Sure.
curate, to put that out there
Yeah.
and make sure that it's here long after we're gone.
Mhm.
I guess one of the things you said, you never thought you'd be a curator.
Mhm.
What did you think you would be?
Oh, I knew I wanted to be an artist. I just didn't know any artists for much of my life. And to backtrack a little bit, I went to Miami University of Ohio for undergrad, and I studied art, and I also studied history. And I had that conversation with my parents. My father is an attorney in Fremont. He's still practicing. My mother was running a college biology department. And so I grew up around the college.
Hmm.
My daycare center was a couple doors down from my mom's lab. And so I was used to kind of campus life and
Hmm.
wanted to be a part of that. I'm very grateful that I get to do that still today with
Right.
the art, because exciting things happen on a campus. And that's because you have a lot of people that are still figuring out what the next step of their life's going to be. They dream big. They're not fully jaded yet by
Right.
that. And they draw that energy from each other.
Right.
And so I went to Miami University and I was studying art, and I did not discover sculpture until my junior year, I think it was. And I had no intention of taking that path because I had never had access to
Right.
sculpture. And all of the sculpture on campus at the time was very contemporary, almost cubist, and it just didn't speak to me. And then all the students were telling me there's this professor you absolutely have to take a class from. He's getting ready to retire. Make sure you take his class. His name's Jim Kelly. So what does he teach? He teaches sculpture. I'm like, "Oh, I'm not sure that I'm going to be a paint. I'm going to be a painter. I don't know that I'm going
Right.
to do that. Take his class." And the short version of the story is Jim is the guy that I credit with making me fall in love with sculpture. And he gave me the foundation, and that was the first time that I had access to things like casting in bronze or learning to build in clay properly and to make molds. And this was before any of the digital tech
Mhm.
existed, and I still do it all the old way. Um, but it opened my mind to the possibility. And then I went on a life changing trip to Rome, and I remember not really having that on my radar at that point in my life that, like, Rome was this place I needed to go. But one of my childhood best friends, her, name at the time is Madeline Coons, she grew up in Fremont, and
Mhm.
she was studying at the American University of Rome, and, she was actually dating a Swiss guard at the time who is one of the there was about 100 of them that are
Right.
the bodyguards of the
Of the
Pope, and it
Pope.
was,
Yeah.
Pope John Paul II at that time. And, uh, short version of the story is I got a tour of the Vatican museums with very few people in the room. So I saw the Sistine Chapel with about 10 people in there for the
Right.
first time. And in that moment, I had a very powerful response to the room that I wasn't anticipating. I thought it was almost a panic attack. I've never had a panic attack, but I had a shortness of breath, I'm tearing up, and I just couldn't stay in the room. I had to physically walk out and stare at the floor, which was the least decorated thing,
Right.
and I went back in the room, and the next 30 minutes were like that, and then I remember the person saying, "Do you wanna go see this, the School of Athens by Raphael?" And I said, "Yeah," and I just started walking, and they're like, "Have you been here before?" I said, "No," and they're like, "How do you know where to find it?" And I said, "I don't know. I just know it's here." And I turned the corner, and there was the School of Athens that Raphael painted when he was 19. I was alone in the room with that, and I was as close as I am to this wall.
Mhm.
Like, I remember I was hovering inches from it, and for the first time, I could see imperfections in the work.
Right.
And I realized, and it's so strange that it took me that long, but I realized he was real. Like, this wasn't
Mhm.
this art deity that came down, and he was my age when he did it at the time. He was
Right.
just 19. And then I'm picturing that room, and he would have had to build scaffold. He would have had to have models because there was no internet, there was no photography. So he's
Right.
working from life. He's doesn't even have paintbrushes. He would have had to make those. He would have had to mix his pigments, and then I realized there wasn't even artificial light, so he would have had to work during daylight hours or by candlelight. And when all of those epiphanies are hitting me, I thought, what is my excuse?
Right.
Like, I have all of those things. Why can't I be doing this? And this is what I want to do. And I remember I was very close to law school at the time because I had a history degree and I wanted to do what my dad did. And he's the type of lawyer I would say that is similar to Atticus Finch and To Kill a Mockingbird. So I never had a bad perception of lawyers or
Right.
attorneys growing up, and I never understood why people did
Right.
because I saw the way people talked about my dad and still do.
Right.
And I thought that's a pretty noble calling. I want to do that and I want to work with him. And I remember that day thinking, how many lawyers from the Renaissance do people still talk about? With the exception of Machiavelli, very few.
Machiavelli.
And I thought, yeah, I want to do this. And then I remember the guard saying, do you like Bernini, who's the greatest sculptor from the Baroque era? I said, yes, I love Bernini. He's like, let me show you something. And he took me to his clay maquettes, the models that he did for the big pieces. His fingerprints were in the clay
Right.
still. And I mean, I have goosebumps telling you. And so I knew at that point, you're going to be an artist. You just have to find a path. And
Right.
I remember my mom picked me up from the Detroit airport. It was the red eye flight, so it was in the middle of the night. And I get my bags, and I get to the car, and we finally get on the expressway. And she says, "How was it?" And I'm exhausted, but I remember just saying it was life changing,
Right.
and that's it. And she just kind of said all you're going to say. And the next thought was, I'm not going to be a lawyer. And I remember the long pause. And then she starts laughing, and it felt at the time like somebody was laughing at a funeral because I misread it. I thought her reaction is the thought of me not being an attorney and being an artist is laughable.
Right.
And then she must have sensed that, and she said, "No, your father always knew you were never gonna be a lawyer." And my dad never pressured me. Neither of
Right.
my parents pressured me to be a lawyer. And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, he said you would have been drawing people when you're supposed to be listening to testimony." And I said, "He's not wrong." And she said, "But it's gonna be harder for you. We don't know any artists."
Right.
And she said, "This is probably gonna be a harder path for you than just being a lawyer would have." And I knew that I knew how hard that path would be. And I said, "Yeah, but I can't see myself doing anything else." So, fast forward a couple of years, I was going back and forth to Italy. I had to go there to learn the way I wanted to learn, to be trained in the old way like Michelangelo. I actually moved to a small town called Pietrasanta, which is right at the foothills of the Carrara Mountains, and I learned to carve using the same tool, the same style. We even worked with, only natural light because I was that obsessive about wanting to see what he experienced.
Mhm.
And, it was at a time before there was cell phone service there, and there was no internet service there, so I was immersed, and I do remember getting a, call when I was doing those apprenticeships, and it was from Northwest Ohio, BG area, and I remember only getting the signal, this was a few years after the first apprenticeship. I was up in a mountain, in a marble quarry, so I must have been high enough that it could get a signal. And I answered, and, they said, "You know, we hear you're in Italy. We're gonna be doing a group study tour with Rotary. Um, would you be interested in speaking about Fremont when we do these stops? But we're gonna it's a month long, and we're gonna hit, 50 cities." And, I said, So what's involved?" And they're like, "Well, you get to go to all these places. We'll put you up with a host family. You do these presentations, and we'll feed you." And I thought, "Yeah, sure, I'll do that." And one of the first nights, we're in this castle, and, somebody from Findlay's presenting in Italian, and they start describing this place, the world's first and largest collection of original art from picture books, and I remember turning to the person next to me who was also from Ohio, and I said, I think, something's getting lost in translation because I swear they just said this place was in Findlay, and I would know about that place." And I went up after the presentation and I asked them in English, "Did I hear that correctly?" And they got out their phone and they had pictures. So I said, "Next time I come back to Ohio, that's my first stop."
Right.
And it was, and there it was. And that's how I first heard about it. And I was embarrassed at that time that I was almost 30 and was not aware that this place existed. And so it's been, a mission of mine as well as the university to make sure that it's not a hidden gem, but
Right.
ironically, I had to go to Italy to hear about it.
I find that very interesting that Findlay, I think, what's our population? 40,000
Yeah.
maybe? Okay, something in there. And folks, after we're done here, I'm going to go downstairs this afternoon, and I'm gonna sit in the Findlay Art League and mind the gallery, and we've been down in this location 40 years, and we still have people that walk in every now and then and go, I've lived in Findlay for 30 years. I never knew this was here."
Yeah.
And folks, if you're not familiar with Findlay, right across the street from us is the courthouse, the municipal building. We are a half a block off of Main Street, and we have people that don't even know we're here. And I find that mind-boggling. Same with Mazza,
Mhm.
that it's this place and it's outreach all the time. It's constant outreach. We're here. We're here. Come and see us. Come and look and see the remarkable things that we're doing. And hopefully all the 29 people this is reaching come to mind. Maybe with Dan's influence, we'll get a few more, I hope. Um, because this is important, because you've said a lot in just the 33 minutes that we've been talking so far. And one of them is looking at the Raphael imperfections.
Mhm.
I like the fact that it hits us, and it hits us all. We've all had this epiphany. There was a real person.
Mhm.
They got up in the morning. They ate.
Yeah.
They and they and you gotta believe that he had to go down there one day and go, I'm not feeling it.
Well, with
Y-
him,
you know,
I had the chance to go to his house that he was born in. And I went to the room he was born in, and I was one of maybe 3 people touring it that day. And again, Italy has such an abundance of
right,
amazing things to see that that's not on the top of most people's list. But I went out into this open air courtyard, and I knew, like, he would have painted here because his father was a painter, he was trained to paint, and there was this little sink that still worked, and it was a stone sink on the outside of the building, and they said, "Yeah, that's where he used to wash his brushes and mix his thing." And they're like, "Go right ahead. You can wash your hands on that." So I
Right.
did. But what I saw was that room he was born in, wasn't anything
Mm-mm.
special. He was dead before he was my age. So he was 37, he died,
Right.
and Rome shut down for the day. And there were about 33 eulogies offered at his funeral, including Michelangelo being one of them. And they had that he was buried in the Pantheon, like,
Hmm.
that was this honor that they put him in a 1,500-year-old building that used to be a temple to all the gods. He was that beloved, and so when you look at in just 30 some years, the impact that that person could
Right.
have, and he lived in a time of giants, when Michelangelo and Leonardo were alive, and he
Hmm.
wasn't don't get me wrong, Raphael was incredible, but Raphael would not have existed without Michelangelo and
Right.
Leonardo's influence before him,
Right.
and those guys had their influence. So you look at that, we're just an extension of the work that has been done
Right.
before us, and now we're living at, I would say, the most interesting crossroads in art history, and that is where the creative process has become, I don't wanna say more accessible, but there's programs like AI now
Yeah.
that make it's a challenge. Now, I don't think artists are going anywhere. If I know artists, we are always the most creative people in the room. What I worry about is the artists that are going to use this early on in their development,
Right.
and they're not going to suffer through the failures that really give you that feeling of
Right.
satisfaction when you finally hit it. And that it's going to shift things the same way that the invention of photography did, and you're a
Right.
photographer, but you know that painting didn't go away like they thought it would.
Right.
And that was, the late 1830s in Paris when photography came about. So I'm observing now what's happening and I'm participating because I'm, an artist and I hear from artists every day that have been lifelong artists, some of them who are cultural figures, and they talk about the way things are shifting.
Hmm.
It doesn't take away from anything they've done and what's come before, but I would encourage artists to step away from the screens when you can and to, live your life and experience, get messy, get dirty,
Right.
because I'm already seeing that people are getting tired of the digital stuff that gets turned out. And it's not to take anything away from digital artists. Digital
No.
artists are
No.
phenomenal. It's just something new we're all dealing with.
It. Yeah. You've touched on a big thing, and especially as a photographer, that and a lot of people will look at me and think I'm nuts. I grew up in film. I'm 65 years old. Okay. I'm not enthralled by film now.
Mhm.
Okay. But young people are. They've discovered, they think they've discovered something new. Well, they have to them.
Sure.
Okay. And good on them, because film, like painting or sculpting or anything, when you go back to, I guess we can use the term old school, it forces you to think,
Yeah.
and it forces you to slow down, and it forces you to observe and to understand. And I'm not a sculptor, but I'm sure that if you hold your tool wrong or you make the wrong strike at the wrong place, the whole piece is done.
Well, you can, if you're
You
good,
if you're
you can
good,
save it.
okay.
Eh,
But you know what I'm
yeah.
trying to say. There are, and yes, and painters can pull paintings back and stuff.
Mhm.
But let's be honest, more than one painter's just chucked a canvas
Sure.
and said, no, it's over. And I've got thousands of photographs. That doesn't mean they're all great.
Sure.
Doesn't mean they're all good. But I know what I'm doing now because I grew up in that old method. We
Yeah.
practice the old methods. And I think it's good to have that foundation. And you're right. Sometimes, and I see people do stuff, and I'm not a big fan of Photoshop. Everybody that follows me on here knows I do very little, if anything, in Photoshop.
Yeah.
Um, I see people that do remarkable stuff, and it's very creative, but I think it needs to be labeled and identified as such,
Sure.
not to be mistaken for, no, that's really not a photograph. No, that's really not. It's a digital illustration.
Yeah.
And I'm sure in the children's illustrations, right? I'm sure there's a few that are just purely digital
Yep.
now,
There
right?
are.
They work on the
Yeah.
iPads or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not don't take anything away from them. They're remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
There's room for all of it, but I think we need to understand what all of it is
Mm-hmm.
and where it's going forward.
Yeah. And I should clarify that, you know, when had some of the artists of history had access to the technology we had. I mean, can you imagine if Da Vinci had access to, like, the CNC machines
Hmm.
and all of that? What else he would have been able to churn out, but would he have spent the time obsessing over things, observing the currents in a stream?
Right.
Probably not. And so I would say, you know, there's artists that art is just a way that we communicate. You know, it's a
Hmm.
form of communication. Not everybody's going to understand the dialect of that language that we speak. Our goal is not to reach out to everybody. It's an
Right.
impossible task. But the ones that resonate, I think, is because there's a connection there at the human level. Now, it has to be amazing for somebody that has never been able to draw in their life to get on a program like Midjourney and put in a prompt and see immediately 100 different images.
Right.
But do they feel the same sense of pride and ownership that somebody feels when, you know, some of my projects have had a 10-year gestation.
Right.
And so to know that you are a different person at the end of that project
Right.
and life happened while that project was
Right.
going on, that to me, I'm so grateful to have been born in that era where I still caught the tail end of life before all of this
Right.
digital hit. I don't know where this is going to lead. It's certainly exciting. It's got a lot of people talking about art, which is never a bad thing.
Right.
Um, but it is something that, you know, it's not going to go away. We can't be ignorant of it.
Right.
But I would say this is a good time for self-reflection as an artist. What gives you the most satisfaction about what you're doing? Do you feel fulfilled by the work? And if you don't feel fulfilled by the work, hopefully you're getting paid for that work
Right.
because that's the other end of it. And I tell people that when they want to pick an art uh, as their lifestyle or as their occupation, is it important to you that it is fulfilling alone, or do you just want the paycheck?
Right.
And there's plenty of people that are phenomenal commercial artists that are happy to be told, make a picture of this that looks like this and
Right.
this. Um, and great on them. For me, I always felt like I wanted the freedom to create what I
Right.
wanted to. And so you have to find a way to make that lifestyle work for you. That path is going to be different for everybody. So I can share my experiences, but it's not going to necessarily help somebody get to the same place.
I can't say it any better. I agree with that. I had a thought, and I remember this while you were talking earlier. Talked about what if, the greats had AI or 3D printing or something, and I can't. My mind is slipping on me right now. There was a painter. He developed a machine,
Hmm.
and it had reflections and a mirror. Well, and I saw a PBS special on it, and it was essentially almost like tracing.
Yeah. So
Um,
that's called the camera obscura.
there it is, the camera
Yeah.
obscura. Yes, talk about that for a minute, because
Sure.
really, at this time, that was the height of technology.
Yeah, and that's been around longer than people realize.
Mhm.
I mean, that's going back to late Renaissance. They were using that
Mhm.
technology so that you would basically create a room and you make a pinhole, like a
Mhm.
pinhole camera, and through the refraction of light, it will create a reversed image of whatever is coming through
Mhm.
that. You can see that happen as a natural phenomenon sometimes. I saw one where a guy had a pinhole in his pole barn, and it was projecting the clouds in the sky on the floor of
Oh,
that.
cool.
So somebody observed that
Right.
phenomenon, figured out how to duplicate it, and then where I would see it used most frequently was when they used to paint portraits, city scenes of Venice. The
Mhm.
tourists doing the tour, the grand tour, all the aristocrats would want a photo before photos existed of
Right.
Venice. So these painters knew that they didn't have time to sit down and map out the perspective of everything. They would set up a pinhole room like that, and they would trace
Right.
an image of Venice, and then they'd go in and hand paint it. So that's where that tech started. Um, I think artists should have a good handle on the technology, but there's been so many times in my career where I've watched people try to ask a computer to do something,
Mhm.
and I've just gone back to fundamental basics. And an example of that was in the marble quarries and in the studios. I still had my carry-on bag with me, and I had met the master that I was gonna carve under, and he wanted to move a block of marble that I now know weighed about 3 tons. but he's like, "You and I need to move this." And he wasn't any bigger than I am,
Right.
but he just had this confidence, like, "You and I together are gonna move that over here in the next 5 minutes." And I said, "Tell me what you need me to do." And I watched him set up wooden rollers and leverage with a pry bar, and we rolled that thing across the studio in 5 minutes. And I thought, "Wow, this is who I'm gonna be staying with.
Right.
I cannot wait." And I remember that one of the carvers, who was the guy that the Vatican would call if they needed to repair like a Michelangelo or they needed something that looked very close to it. He was the carver. His son was my age, and he was like this tech expert, and he had developed this technology called the brain. It's what he was calling it, but it was a turntable, and he could put a model of a sculpture on this turntable, and there would be a finger, like a stylus that would just
Mhm.
trace it, and then there was a block of marble on a bigger turntable that was synced up to that, and it would carve that surface. So it was an early example of what like a CNC machine
Mhm.
or
Well,
CNC machines had been around a
yeah.
while, but it was a milling machine for
Right.
marble.
Right.
And he's like, "Oh yeah, we're getting a lot of commissions out of China to make these things." And I remember a very well-known, I would say he's in the top 10 in the world, artist came in. And I'm like, "Holy cow, that's so and so." And, they said, "Yeah." And I said, "What's he doing here? Is he gonna carve?" And they said, "Oh, he doesn't carve. He just hires my dad to make these pieces." And I'm like, "Seriously?" He's like, "Yeah, that's how it works."
Right.
And so when I had gone over there, they had a very when I said I was an artist, they didn't have a high impression of a lot of artists because the artists were the guys that just gave them the idea and paid them to make the thing.
Oh, okay.
And so when I said, "I wanna learn how to do it," they're like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Well," that changed the whole conversation. And that day, this guy brought in this model, and he's like, "I want this." And I said, "How long will that take your dad to make that?" And he said, "About a week." And I'm like, "How?" And I said, "He's gonna use the brain." And he goes, "He doesn't use the brain." And his dad, while this artist left, goes back into the forge and starts hammering out his own chisels. And he's making these really long chisels. And he's like, "Come back in a week, and my dad'll have that done." And I remember walking to his dad, and I'm like, "Are you gonna use a pointing machine?" Which is a very antiquated way to do it. And he goes, "No." I said, "What do you" he goes, "I just see through the block." And that's something Michelangelo used to say he would do, and I thought it was just something that the
Right.
carvers would do to mess with you. But he's like, "No, I just know I carved down till I hit skin like Michelangelo."
Right.
So 6 days later, he had it done, and he did it by hand in the old way. And I thought, yeah, that's why everybody's still coming to him even with the tech,
Right.
and that's the guy that trained me. Um, and I'm so grateful for that because it showed me I don't know, sometimes I think of it like John Henry, which is, the story of
Mhm.
the man that took on the locomotive, and
Right.
he's trying to drive, rail ties faster than this machine, and spoiler alert, he succeeds, but he dies doing it.
Right.
So with his last breath, he proves that, like, yes, willpower and a human doing this still beats a machine, and that was during the Industrial
Right.
Revolution. So I'm happy to die on that hill that, I'd rather go out swinging literally as a
Right.
sculptor, than just crank out thousands of pieces because think about it. If you were to ask a creative person, would you be willing to work your whole life to create one piece that the average person who knows nothing about art would recognize? And I'm talking Mona Lisa, Starry Night,
Right.
those types of pieces. I think most of us would say yes,
Yeah.
if we could get that one thing.
The
If you
one.
ask a musician, could you make that one hit, that Stairway to Heaven that everybody still talks about and
Right.
obsesses over the meaning of long after you're gone,
Right.
would you do it? And I think yes. Now, for a lot of these artists, back then, the reason I love the Renaissance is because they didn't stop after one hit,
No.
and they completely changed, he wasn't a he wasn't a painter when he did the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He was trained by the best painter of his time, but he still signed the contract, sculptor. He was mad that
Right.
he had to do it. He did that after the David, and then what was he working on when he died? The largest dome in the world, the
Right.
Vatican dome, and that was before any computer system existed that could mock that up. So he's having to physically at 89, figure out how to make that work just out of his own ingenuity. And so I look anytime I'm feeling sorry for myself in the studio, when the Wi-Fi is down and I can't look at the
Right.
reference
Right.
picture, I'm like, There's not a rival city-state that's sacking Findlay right now. There's not bubonic plague, although COVID was very
Right.
similar for
COVID
me.
was that was an
But
interesting
I
time
did have
frame.
multiple COVID projects that I took on wanting them to be big life-changing projects, and they were because I knew I hope it's very unusual that I ever get this amount of time
Right.
to just be by myself working in the studio. So,
I want to ask
mhm,
because there's a lifelong seems to be this big debate between art and craft.
mhm,
And I've heard and I like the term artisan because that almost seems like an amalgamation of artist and
mhm,
craftsman.
mhm.
Okay. I don't know. Can you differentiate between the two? Like
Sure.
sculpting, there is a craft
Yeah,
involved in it.
yeah.
What's your take on that?
So I learned when I was there studying in Italy, the difference between an artist and an artisan to them was that the artist was the person that generated the idea, the artisan was the person that brought it into existence. So a lot of sculptors were hiring craftsmen who specialized in like maybe clay sculpture. Then they'd hire a mold maker. Then they'd hire somebody that could work in wax. Then they would get a caster in a foundry, and then they'd get a finisher. I wanted to learn all of that.
Right.
So, to me, craft is an a craft can be an art, and I often reflect on, there is a book I'm blanking on the title of, he's the most famous samurai, Musashi in Japan, and in his life story, he writes he was the best swordsman that samurai swordsman that ever lived in Japan. There's a scene where he's walking through a village and he sees a ceramicist's table of wares set out, and he fixates on this one cup. And he has the epiphany. The cup is so exquisite in its craftsmanship. He's like, if this was a swordsman, he would kill me. He's that good in his
Right.
craft. So can craft be art? Absolutely. But for me, it's the difference between, is it a hobby? Is it something that you engage for fun and
Mhm.
enjoyment? And that is great if that's what you want. Or is it something that you have poured your life
Mhm.
into and you have honed that to the point of perfection, or as close to you can get as
Right.
perfection? And I would say the true test of that is, can you make the average person stop for reasons they can't fully explain and have a emotional reaction or a physical reaction when they encounter that thing?
Right.
And to me, that's one of the greatest rushes in the world, when I can take something that was quite literally dirt and water,
Mhm.
clay, and create something that can either make somebody shiver or cry. And I remember the very first time that ever happened to me, was in grad school, and I had done a piece, a Pieta, which is a depiction of Mary holding the body of Christ, and it wasn't a duplicate of anything that had been created. It was my own
Right.
take. But I had a person come into the art studio, and a lot of the art students would leave to go drink at this bar across the corner. And he said he was a professor, not he was a mathematician that liked to hang out in the art building. And he said, "You're always up there working. Why don't you come out with us tonight? Like, what's one night away from the studio?" And I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll take you into my studio and I'll show you what I'm working on. And if you still think after you go through my studio that I'm better served going over to the bar tonight, I'll see you over there." And I walk in, and he sees I have 3 colossal sculptures, but one of them is the life-size Pieta, and I remember pulling the sheet off of it, and he just said, "Do you mind if I have some time alone in here, like 10 minutes alone?" And I said, "Not at all." And he was a big man, and he started to tear up, which I was not expecting because I had
Mhm.
never seen this side of him. I said, "Take your time. I'll be outside." So I walked outside, and he came out, and he said, "I think you better go back in there tonight." And he never pressured me to leave the
Right.
studio again. But I found out later that he had a personal story that piece took him
Right.
into, and he realized the value in, sometimes some of us have to lock ourselves away. Doesn't mean that we're being antisocial,
Right.
but we're just feeling pulled to this thing that is meant to provoke a reaction when we're no longer in the room.
Right.
And that was where I was at that night.
It's remarkable what and I guess the term unintended consequence can apply sometimes. I've had an experience or two in the studio here during Art Walk, where when people walk in, they get a free photo. We do a real quick, fun thing back
Mhm.
here. No posing, no anything. It's just a fun little memento type thing. And the feedback I've gotten from 4, 5, 6 different people now, it's remarkable.
Mhm.
That we're just having fun. We're just snapping a photo. If I could show you my studio, the other side of it here, it's nothing elaborate, it's nothing special. One person said it was the best photograph they'd ever had taken of them after their car accident,
Wow.
and they never wanted their photo taken because her face had been slightly disfigured.
Yeah.
She put it on her Facebook page. People just rant and raved over it, and she said it was a remarkable experience. Folks, look at me. I'm a big guy. I'm tattooed. I'm reading this thing. I'm tearing up.
Yeah.
Okay. My kids will tell you, Dad never cries. The only time they saw me cry was when my appendix burst. And
Oh,
then
that'll
my
do
kids
it.
went and told mom, they said, something's wrong with Dad because he's crying. And we ended up in the emergency room. Little personal disclosure there. But I'm not thinking that same thing.
Yeah.
I'm doing what I'm doing here, but you never know. And I love that story. You never know. I'll just, hey, here you go. And, if he'd have walked out there and went, yeah, okay, cool. Let's go get a beer.
Yeah.
Totally different. You would have had a totally different response.
Sure.
But to be asked and then to have that type of influence and that type of effect
Yeah.
on somebody it's a very moving experience. And I don't know if a lot of artists get to experience that. You got to experience it.
Yeah,
And
I joke that I'm jealous of musicians. It's not that I didn't study music for a chapter of my life,
right,
but it's a different way that they get to experience their art form.
right,
And I used to say that I was jealous, but now I'm fortunate enough to know a few that that's their lifestyle. And what I was looking at the time I made that comment was, wow, you get to experience your art with a whole stadium of people that are singing it back to you.
right,
And like, how cool is that? But then what I realized is, wow, you're repeating the same thing night after night, and you have to pretend you're as passionate about
right,
it the 10,000th time that you
right,
sang it. Whereas, as an artist, when people ask what kind of art I make and they've never met me, I said, well, I'm a storyteller first and I'm an illusionist.
hmm,
And they said, well, what does that mean? And I said, well, magician creates this effect that's going to produce a response from you. But it's a very controlled situation. They can control your vantage point. They can control the lighting. They can control the timing. They can distract you. And they're in the room. I said, my job is to create something so realistic that I'm not in the room. It can be under studio lighting. You can walk around at 360 degrees and you still can't figure out how the trick is
right,
done. And if I can the longer I can suspend disbelief, the more I've got you. And I remember a study when I was in college. I think they did it at the Getty Museum. They wanted to see what is the average time a museum viewer spends in front
hmm,
of a world-class work of art. And
right,
I'm talking about one of those pieces, again, that you wouldn't have to be an art
right.
historian to know. What do you think the average amount of time, this is pre-cell phone, people were spending in front of a masterpiece?
Oh, I'm going to say something ridiculous like 15 seconds, 20 seconds,
It was 3 seconds.
3.
And now it's even shorter.
Right.
And so one of the things I used to do when I taught art history was when I traveled, I'd go to a place like Rome and I'd go up in front of the Pieta and I would turn my back on the Pieta after I'd had my
Mhm.
moment with it, and there'd often be a crowd. Usually I'd go before the crowd and then I'd stay long enough that there'd be a crowd. And I would photograph the crowd and then I would share those pictures with my students. And you could count on one hand the number of people that weren't looking at it through a lens.
Right.
And I said, you're never going to get as good of a picture as the postcard you can buy in the
Nope.
gift shop
Nope, I
for
agree.
99 cents.
Yep.
When you make it that far, if you're fortunate to be in the presence of something that great, just be in its
Be in
presence
the
and
moment.
experience it. And what I used to assign my students was, I said, you have one paper that you have to write, which is pretty easy for the semester. I said, one paper. And you're going to have to go to a museum as part of this. You can go to any art museum you want, and admission is often free.
Mhm.
And I would point them usually to the Toledo Museum because that was the closest one. And I said, you have to find 3 things in there that make you stop for longer than 3 seconds. And it's your choice. If you want to walk in the lobby and find the first 3 things and
Right.
write about them, that's for you. But take a picture of yourself there and submit that. And if you want to go to the trouble of photoshopping and you can fool me with that picture, then I'll still give you a good grade. But what they would do, I just wanted to get them there. And
Right.
I would learn that many of these non-traditional students who were sometimes 50 years old or older had never been to an art museum.
Right.
And so they'd go to the Toledo Museum and they're like, we saw Van Gogh. We saw, we saw Picasso original. We saw Monet. I'm like, yeah. And it was free.
Yeah.
Like you paid for parking.
Right.
You walked in and there it was. And they would go back. And so it wasn't at all about what they wrote.
Right.
I just wanted them to see that like you don't have to buy a plane ticket
Right.
to have those moments. And I would say, even as somebody who spends every day in a museum, pretty much sleeps in a museum because my art is at the house, it never gets old.
Right.
There's never a day that I walk through and I take for granted, like that's that original by one of my heroes hanging on the wall right
Right.
there.
I thought it was interesting. You made a point earlier, and I wanted to interject this because as anybody who's listened to this, everybody knows that Dark Side of the Moon is my all-time favorite.
Mhm.
I listen to it 2-3 times a week still. It's 50 years old. I was watching a documentary about it, and this absolutely floored me because I'm the same thing. You're thinking, man, everybody wants to be a rock star,
Yeah.
right? And up on stage, you're performing and you're this and this and the adulation and everything. David Gilmour said he never had the pleasure of putting on a pair of headphones and listening to Dark Side of the Moon for the first time
Wow.
because he knows how the sausage is made.
Yeah.
I, on the other hand, when I was, I think, 13, 14, had a buddy of mine with an older brother, 8-track,
Yeah.
and he said, you got to hear this. Went back home, laid down in bed at night, put my headphones on, and experienced Dark Side of the Moon for the first time.
Yeah.
It was mind-blowing. I'm 65 years old. I still remember it today.
Yeah.
And what you said was this idea that we know how the sausage is made.
Sure.
We're behind it. But I thought, oh my God, David Gilmour never had the same experience I had.
Yeah.
And that just floored me. This was 4 or 5 years ago I found this out.
I have never heard that before, and it is a brilliant perspective. At the same time, I would say the amazing thing about that is that to be in the room with somebody when they experience something
Right.
you've created for the first time, I love those moments.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of people I
Well-
want to be in the room with because I joke by the time it's in the gallery, I'm so done looking at that thing and thinking about it. I want to move on with my life.
Right.
But when you can see somebody that you care about that is like, oh my gosh,
Right.
that's a cool response.
Now, I've been in the room where some people have experienced my work, and I had to learn to get a really thick skin
Oh yeah.
because they didn't know who I was.
Yeah.
They made a few comments about my photograph that were not kind.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's out there too.
Yeah.
And you have to learn to take that too if you're going to expose yourself.
Yeah. I have those moments too.
Yeah.
Especially with social media being what it is.
Yeah.
You're going to have somebody that, they wake up in the morning and their mission is just to try to ruin
Right.
people's day.
Right.
And that's, they do their thing. You have to have the thick skin to be an artist.
Yes.
And I tell people, it is important as an artist to have an ego, but people shouldn't know you have the ego.
Right.
And what I mean by ego is you have to have the self-confidence that you can bring something into the world that does not yet exist when everybody thinks it's a bad idea. Because remember, all these great artists had to do just that at one
Yes.
point.
Yeah.
There were people that thought they were out of their minds
Right.
when they pitched these things. And then once they did it, everybody was their biggest fan and they were
Right.
always a supporter. So I think as an artist, you build a thick skin. And now one of the suggestions I would give to my students, and I still do, is I would ask them who their favorite artists were.
Mhm.
And they make a list and that sometimes they would have to write a reflection on that artist. And I would ask them to write about the greatest personal failures of that individual. And I just learned about one yesterday that I don't know how I didn't know this, but I like Frank Lloyd Wright.
Mhm.
I love a lot of architecture, but he was exceptional in just what he was doing at the
Mhm.
time. And I had no idea that he got in an affair. So I knew he had multiple relations with women. But he left his family, 6 kids, when he was at the height of his career to have this affair. He starts a new life in a new house that he built, and that woman and his kids were all murdered in that house.
Well, I didn't know that.
And he never left that house. He stayed in that house, he rebuilt it, he stayed there the rest of his life.
Wow.
And I thought, that's something you don't think about when you're visiting a place like Falling Water.
Right.
You're told that he designed it perfectly the first time he sketched it, and he built it, they didn't even have cement mixers. He's
Right.
using wheelbarrows in the woods to make that. And so that's when I started studying, early on when I decided I was gonna be an artist. Where were the failures? Like, what were they enduring when they made this great thing?
Right.
We already know the end of the story, and you'd find that the stories behind the greatest works in the world were far more compelling sometimes than the piece
Then the
itself.
piece themselves.
And so I would say, if you're struggling, if you're feeling sorry for yourself in the studio, if you're coming up with 100 excuses not to do that thing you should be doing, look at who made you want to be an artist in the first place. It doesn't even have to be an artist. It
Right.
could be a chef, it could be an athlete, it could be anybody. And find me one that hasn't dealt with adversity
Right.
and reached that level of success, because I have yet to see that.
We're coming up on, this has been a wonderful conversation. I ask 2 questions usually when I start to wrap up,
Mhm.
and we could go for hours here,
Sure.
and there may be a return
Sure.
because
I'm right down the street.
yeah, right down the street, and this is, I love these kind of conversations, but 2 things. So, 1, when you're in the studio, what's on your playlist?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. It depends on what I'm working on.
Okay.
So sometimes I don't want to be hung up on lyrics, and a lot of what I do is so loud, I I'm not listening to anything. I might have like industrial headphones
Okay.
on to block noise. And so a lot of times in the studio, I'm deliberately depriving some of my senses to not get injured or to
Okay.
stay hyper aware of what I'm
Okay.
working on. But if I am at a point where I can listen, it has to be thematic with the work, okay? So I make a lot of monsters and creatures, but
Mhm.
I'm not gonna be listening to anything light and cheery when I'm doing that. Um, and it's a whole range. When I was working on, like, I did a big piece in grad school that was the fall of Lucifer. Okay, so it's Saint Michael and
Sure.
Lucifer, and I was listening to a lot of like Requiem and Dies Irae and Intense, like, and those things were playing in the gallery when the exhibit ran, so people could see what headspace I was
Sure.
in. When I was working on the Pieta, it was a lot of that Ave Maria and religious music.
Mhm.
When I'm working on something a little more intense, like I just did a Yeti hockey goalie that is just like this intense beast. And I had a lot of music playing from when I used to play hockey because I wanted to be on the ice in the
Sure.
game, in the arena, and that was, what helped me to get that piece done. And then I was working on something lately, and I did a painting in 8 hours, start to finish, and I was listening to the audiobook Picture of Dorian Gray,
Yep.
and I had never listened to that book. I had read it a long time ago, but I thought, okay, 8 hours, let's see how far I get.
Right.
And I just got in such a groove listening to that story that the piece was done the moment the narration stopped. That's the only time that has ever happened
Wow.
to me. But for me, what I want to find is something that it's kind of like a sommelier does with wine. You want to pair that with the food that
Right.
brings out the best in both,
Right.
but you don't want something that's going to take away from the other. And if I can't find that balance, I work in silence
Okay.
and I just settle into the rhythm of the sounds of what I'm doing, which if you're carving or it's pretty nice rhythm that you get into. So
That's fair.
yeah.
I like that, and I like the idea of thematic. I like to do that if I'm shooting up here. Um, if I've got a mood or something I want, I've got that in the background because
Mhm.
I like that idea too of having something that supports it, maybe unconsciously, but it does.
Sure.
The last thing I want to ask, and I always ask people to do it in 1 or 2 sentences, and it never happens, which is fine. And you've touched on a little bit of it. Your advice to anyone starting out their creative journey, regardless of age. So not just little kids, not just what would you tell them? They come to you and say, Dan, I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I'll do it in one sentence.
Okay.
Make art, not excuses.
There it is, folks. I can't say it any better than that. I think Nike beat you with just do it.
Yeah.
But we have to credit Nike for that now. I probably owe Nike
copyright
money.
that, by the way. So.
Yeah, there you go.
Before Nike gets it.
So, hey, everybody, I want to thank Dan for taking the time to come up to the studio. This has been a remarkable conversation. There may be more in the future because I think there's a lot to talk about. And and I think this never ends. So I want to thank you for coming and joining us at the Creative Frequency. I encourage you to do all the social stuff, the like, the subscribe, the follow, tell your friends. Dan, once again, thank you. I appreciate it. And all the socials and everything for Mazza and for Dan's work. And you want to find out about Findlay, check us out. Until the next time, thanks for checking in. We'll see you again. Thank you for tuning in to the Creative Frequency. You know what to do. Like, follow, and subscribe. Then join us again for the next episode of the Creative Frequency.